The ice was breathing. That was the first thing Nora Vale noticed. Not cracking, not dripping, breathing. A pale thread of mist slipped out of the frozen cliff and curled across her cheek like warm breath from a sleeping animal. Nora stopped so suddenly her boots slid in the snow. The ravine around her was locked in winter. The creek below had gone silent beneath a lid of ice. Pine branches hung stiff and white. Even the rocks looked dead. But the wall beside her was giving off heat. Not enough to melt the whole place, just enough to make the air wrong. Nora lifted one bare hand from her shawl and held it near the stone. Warm. She pulled back, because in the Bitterroot foothills in January, warm stone meant one of two things: a trap or a secret. 9 days earlier, Nora had still been living under a roof. It was not a loving roof. Not after her father died. Not after her aunt remarried. Not after every plate at the table began to feel like something Nora had stolen. She was 19, and that was the word her uncle kept returning to. 19. Old enough to earn. Old enough to stop eating someone else's flour. Old enough, he said, to quit haunting a house that was no longer hers. He did not shout when he sent her away. That almost made it worse. He simply placed her satchel beside the door before sunrise. Inside were 2 dresses, wool socks, a cracked comb, a tin cup, a pocket knife, and $9 folded into a handkerchief. Her aunt stood in the kitchen with red eyes and said nothing. By noon, Nora was walking north along a wagon track that had already begun disappearing under snow. She had a plan at first. Everyone does before hunger gets involved. There were logging camps beyond Elk Ridge. There were sheep stations that sometimes hired girls to cook. There was a mining road where supply teams passed twice a week if the weather held. But the weather did not hold. The first storm came hard and early, then a second one folded over it. By the 4th morning, the wagon track was gone. The sky had turned the color of iron, and Nora understood that work would have to wait. Living came first. She left the road and followed a dry wash toward the mountains, hoping the walls would cut the wind. That was how she found St. Scar. People in the valley called it that because lightning had split the ridge long before anyone living could remember. From a distance, it looked like a dark wound in the mountain. Up close, it was a narrow ravine with black stone walls, frozen ledges, and a creek that vanished beneath shelves of ice. Nobody wintered there. Too steep, too shadowed, too far from help. To Nora, that sounded like privacy. Her first shelter was a miserable shelf beneath an overhang. She piled branches across the front and wrapped herself in every piece of cloth she owned. The cold still found her. It came through the blanket. It came through her boots. It came through her thoughts. By morning, her water cup had frozen solid beside her head. That day she searched for a better place before the next storm pinned her down. She moved slowly along the ravine wall, testing rock with her hand, looking for any hollow, any root cellar, any forgotten miner's cut. Near dusk the wind changed. Nora smelled wet stone. Then she felt the heat. It came from a seam behind a curtain of blue ice, so faint she almost walked past it. A soft ribbon of warmth sliding through a vertical split in the rock. She cleared snow with her boot. The ice curtain trembled. Behind it was a gap no wider than her shoulder. Nora held her breath, turned sideways, and squeezed through. For a moment the stone scraped both her back and chest. Then the world opened. Her lantern light widened into darkness. The chamber inside the cliff was not a little cave. It was a hidden room of stone, taller than a cabin and deeper than a church aisle. The floor sloped gently downward. The ceiling arched above her in black ribs, and along the far wall, water shone in a shallow pool that did not freeze. Nora stared at it. The pool steamed, not wildly, not like a boiling kettle, just enough to fog the rock above it and soften the air. She took one step, then another. The chamber was dry near the entrance, warmer near the pool, and completely shielded from the wind. Someone had found it before her. That much was clear. Rusted spikes had been driven into the wall. A broken plank shelf leaned in the dust. Old candle stubs sat in a tin nailed to a beam. Miners, maybe, prospectors, men who came looking for ore and left behind the only treasure Nora needed, shelter. For the first time in more than a week, she sat down without shaking. The mountain held the heat like a stove holding coals. The narrow crack kept the wind out. The warm seep kept the chamber alive. Nora did not understand all of it, but she understood enough. The cliff was breathing because something under the mountain was still warm, and now so was she. She moved in that night, not gracefully. She dragged branches through the crack. She stacked stones around the driest corner. She hung her blanket from 2 old spikes to block the draft. She cleaned mud from the shelf and made places for her cup, knife, and the little food she had left. By the 3rd day, she had found a second pocket in the rock, high and dry enough for sleeping. By the 5th, she had built a crude platform from fallen cedar poles. By the 7th, she had learned the chamber's moods. In the morning, the entrance breathed cooler. At night, the warm pool deepened its mist. If the wind outside struck the ravine straight on, snow packed over the crack and made the inside warmer. The place was not magic. That made it better. Magic could vanish. Stone did not. The first person to see it was Abram Pike, an old packer who hauled mail when roads allowed and gossip when they did not. He spotted a smear of smoke above St. Scar and came down expecting to find a campfire. Instead, he found Nora stepping out of a cliff. Abram jerked back so hard he nearly dropped his rifle. "Girl," he said, "rocks are not supposed to open." Nora tightened her shawl. "This one does." He stared at the ice wall, then at the narrow split. "There's nothing back there. There is if you turn sideways." Abram did not want to try. Curiosity beat caution. He squeezed through, cursed twice, and disappeared. When he came back out, his face had changed. Not frightened, offended. As if the mountain had personally lied to him for 60 years. "That ravine's got a room inside it," he muttered. Nora smiled. "Several, and it's warm. Warmer than out here." Abram looked up at the frozen walls, then back at Nora. "Nobody will believe this. They don't have to, but they did hear about it." By the time Abram reached the general store, the story had already improved itself. The orphan girl had found a hot spring inside a cliff. No, she had found an Indian burial cave. No, she had found a furnace left by silver miners. No, she had gone half mad from cold and was sleeping in a crack with a lantern, calling it a house. Men laughed beside the stove. Women shook their heads. Children dared each other to walk near St. Scar after dark. Nora heard pieces of it when she went into town for flour and salt. She kept her eyes down and paid with 2 of her $9. Let them laugh. Every night they went home to walls that rattled in the wind. She went home to a stone chamber that breathed warm air into her hands. Then the barometer fell. It happened so fast that even people who trusted almanacs more than instruments began to worry. At Judd's store, the glass dropped hour after hour. Horses turned restless in their stalls. Dogs refused to leave porches. The sky went low and green-gray over the ridge. On the second evening, a telegraph rider came in from the rail station with frost on his eyebrows and bad news in his mouth. A polar front was sliding down from Canada. Temperatures had broken records 2 counties north. Livestock were dying in the open. The storm line behind it was wider than the valley. By morning, the road east would be closed. By the day after that, no one might be moving at all. The laughter about Nora's cliff house stopped sounding quite as easy. Abram came to St. Scar before dark. He found Nora carrying split pine through the entrance. "You staying here through it?" he asked. Nora looked past him at the bruised sky. Then she looked back into the chamber, at the plank platform, the stone shelf, the steaming pool, the blanket wall, the little order she had built from rejection and cold. "Yes," she said. Abram rubbed his jaw. "Might be the smartest thing in this whole valley." The storm arrived before dawn. It did not begin with flakes. It began with sound. A long, low roar moved over the ridge like a train no one could see. Nora woke on her platform and listened as the ravine outside filled with violence. Wind hit the cliff. Snow hissed through the crack. Somewhere above, a pine snapped. Inside, the lantern flame leaned once, then stood upright again. Nora sat very still. The chamber held. She walked to the entrance and looked out. The ravine had become a white throat. Snow rushed through it sideways. The creek was gone. The far wall appeared and vanished in waves. Air struck her face so cold it hurt her teeth. She stepped back. 3 paces inside, the pain faded. 10 paces inside, her hands stopped stinging. Near the warm pool, the air was almost gentle. That was when Nora understood what the cave really was. Not a hiding place, a border. Outside, winter owned everything. Inside, winter had to ask permission. The first knock came that afternoon. It was not a knock exactly, more like a dull scraping against ice. Nora pulled away the frozen branches at the entrance and found Abram Pike on his knees in the drift. Behind him was a boy no older than 12, his lips blue, one mitten missing. "Found him by the north fence," Abram gasped. "Couldn't get him home." Nora pulled them both through. The boy began crying as soon as the warm air touched him. Not loudly, just a thin, broken sound, as if his body had been waiting for permission. She wrapped his hands in cloth, set him near the steaming pool, and made him sip melted snow. Abram watched the boy's color return. Then he looked around the chamber the way a man looks around a church after a miracle he does not want to name. By nightfall, 3 more people came. A widow whose stovepipe had blown loose. 2 brothers from a line cabin with no roof left on the south side. The next morning brought a mother carrying a baby under her coat and a little girl holding on to her skirt with both hands. After that, people stopped arriving one by one. They came in clusters, a family with frostbitten chickens in a crate, a miner with a burned hand from trying to relight a dead stove, 2 old sisters who had laughed the hardest at Judd's store and now would not meet Nora's eyes. Nora did not ask who had believed her. She only pointed them toward the warmer end of the chamber. Soon the cave changed. Blankets hung between spikes. Boots lined the dry wall. Children slept beneath coats on cedar boughs. Someone brought sacks of beans. Someone brought coffee. Someone brought a cast-iron pot so large it took 2 men to carry it through the crack. The warm pool steamed steadily at the back, and the stone gave back every bit of heat the people made. Abram tested it with an old thermometer from the store. Outside the entrance, the mercury sank below anything printed on the card. Inside, near the sleeping ledge, it stayed above freezing. Near the pool, it climbed higher. Not just warm, Abram said quietly. Stable. That word traveled through the chamber, stable. People needed that word more than they needed miracle. Stable meant the babies could sleep. Stable meant water could be kept liquid. Stable meant old lungs might last the night. Stable meant the mountain had become a roof no wind could tear off. For 6 days the valley disappeared. No roads, no fence lines, no wagon ruts. Only snow and wind and the occasional boom of something collapsing under weight. Inside the cliff, people learned to live in layers. The strongest slept closest to the entrance and took turns clearing the crack. Families stayed near the middle. The sick and smallest rested by the warm pool. Nora moved among them with a tin cup, a knife, and a calm she did not know she possessed. People began asking her where to put things, how to block the draft, which wall stayed driest, when to scrape snow away from the entrance, and when to leave it packed for insulation. She answered because she knew. That was the part nobody had expected. The girl they had pitied, mocked, and half forgotten knew the mountain better than anyone alive. On the 7th night, the wind became worse. It did not howl anymore, it hammered. Snow sealed the entrance so completely that even Abram looked afraid. The air inside grew close, and for the first time, the chamber's warmth felt dangerous instead of kind. Nora remembered a narrow chimney of cracked rock above the old miner's shelf. During quiet days, she had felt cool air there, barely moving. She climbed to it with Abram, holding the lantern below. The crack was choked with old debris and ice crystals. She worked her pocket knife into it, then a cedar splinter, then both hands. Stone cut her knuckles. Dust fell into her eyes. Someone below told her to come down. Nora kept digging. At last the plug gave way. A thin stream of air moved across her face. Cold, clean. The lantern flame below steadied. The chamber breathed again. Nobody laughed then. Nobody whispered about madness. They watched Nora climb down with bleeding hands, and in that silence something shifted that storm could shift back. By the 9th morning, the roar outside began to loosen. By afternoon, light returned to the crack. On the 10th day, Nora stepped out into a valley remade in white. Barns sagged, fences vanished, smoke rose from only half the chimneys. The road to the rail station was gone beneath drifts taller than a horse. But people were alive. A lot more people than would have been. When the thaw finally came weeks later, Saint's Scar became the most visited place in the foothills. Not because people wanted a legend, because they wanted to measure it. A schoolmaster came with a notebook and wrote about the warm seep and the insulated rock. A surveyor said the chamber likely sat over a deep fault where groundwater carried heat upward. Abram insisted on showing everyone the thermometer marks he had scratched into a plank. The two old sisters brought Nora a quilt and never once mentioned the jokes they had told by the store stove. Her aunt came last. She stood outside the entrance for a long time before Nora saw her. The woman looked smaller than Nora remembered. "I heard what you did," her aunt said. Nora glanced back into the chamber, now swept clean and bright with late winter sun. "I found a warm place," she answered. Her aunt shook her head. "No. You noticed one." That stayed with Nora, because the cliff had always been there. The crack had always been there. The warm breath had probably slipped through that wall for years, while hunters, packers, miners, and laughing townsmen walked past it without stopping. Nora had stopped because she had nothing left except attention, and attention had become shelter. Shelter had become proof. Proof had become survival. By spring, she had planted beans in a sheltered patch below the ravine. By summer, she had a real door fitted into the crack and shelves along the stone wall. By autumn, people stopped calling it the cliff house as a joke. They called it warm wall. And every winter after that, when the first hard snow crossed the ridge, someone would ride to St. Scar and check the entrance, the vent, the pool, and the woman who had turned a frozen cliff into the safest house in the valley. Nora never forgot the day she first felt the mountain breathe, because everyone had seen the ice, everyone had seen the stone, everyone had seen the ravine, but she had noticed the one thing that did not belong. A thread of warm air slipping out of a frozen wall, and sometimes that is all survival gives you at first. Not a rescue, not a plan, just one impossible detail, small enough to miss, strong enough to save everyone who doesn't.